Today, I want to talk about how to record a podcast with a remote guest. Now, if you're thinking about going out there and starting your own podcast, chances are that you're going to want to have guests on your show. Now, you may be thinking, how am I going to have this guest on my show? How am I going to interview them on my show? So, I just wanted to walk you through a couple of different steps that you should be taking if you want to record a podcast with a remote guest. The first step is you're going to want to select an interview platform. And what I mean by that is where you're going to conduct your interviews. There's a couple of different platforms out there that you can use. The two that I have used have been Zoom, and I've also used Riverside. My preference has been Riverside. I found for me, it just worked functionally better. I like the aspect of it where I record the interview on my end, and then I also get a recording of just guests talking on their end. I'm not sure if Zoom has changed this, but back when I was using Zoom, if you had a guest where I was talking quiet, they were talking loud, it was very hard because then you have to go through and you'd really have to edit the interview down. Where now, if I'm talking quiet and the guest is talking loud, maybe we increase my voice and we decrease the voice of the guest. So that's really why I prefer Riverside. You're going to want to test the setup going into the interview. And what I mean by that is on the platform within Riverside is it'll choose like which camera I want to use. So like I have a webcam that I like to use, just higher, better quality than just using my computer's camera. And then I also have my podcast mic. I just want to make sure that my podcast microphone is selected, whether I'm on Zoom, whether I'm on Zencaster, whether I am on Riverside, whether I'm on all these different platforms where you can record interviews. So I just want to make sure my podcast mic is selected instead of me going through doing the entire podcast interview and seeing that nothing is selected. You also want to check the setup of your guest that you're having on. You want to make sure that their sound quality is good, make sure that you can see them clearly. If not, I'd recommend rescheduling the interview. But for me, that's been very few and far between whether it's ever had to happen. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. As an option, you can use headphones. I just personally don't prefer to use headphones, but people do use headphones. So I just want to make a quick mention of that. Sometimes you see folks using headphones. They say that it helps in noise reduction. If you do want to use them, but again, on my end, I just don't prefer to use them. I just not my personal choice. You want to set up your recording software. So you could use like an Audacity, you could use a GarageBand. For me, what I've always done is when I'm recording, I just record either through Zoom or I just record through Riverside just to make it easier on myself. So you just want to make sure you have some sort of recording software set up. What some folks might do is have an additional software set up where I'm recording on Riverside and then I'm also recording through an Audacity, through a GarageBand, depending on your type of computer. So there's always that option as well. You want to make sure you have a time that you're going to record to have an interview with the podcast guest that you're going to be interviewing. You really are going to want a scheduling management platform. So I recommend like Calendly. I find Calendly is the best. It's easiest for me to use. I know that there's other schedules out there. I've used Acuity in the past, but overall I found Calendly was perfect. It just makes it easier when I'm reaching out to someone to be a guest on my podcast, and I can just send them, hey, do you want to be a guest on my podcast? And they say, sure. Here's a link to my Calendly. Here's a link to my schedule. They can book a time. Instead of me going back and forth, sometimes that may come up if none of the times I have suggested work for the guest, and I'll have to wiggle around a little bit. But I just want to make it as easy as possible for the podcast guest. And then once you're on, you want to make sure that you hit the start button. That's really the most important thing. If you're new to it, new to recording interviews, you want to make sure you hit the start button. And it's just simple. Early on, I just put a sticky note, hit the start button, just make sure that I'm recording. There's been instances when I first started a podcast back in 2015 where I had a very successful individual on my podcast and I just forgot to hit the start button and went through the entire interview, got to the end and realized it hadn't been recording the entire time. That was very much a disappointment. That gentleman's time is very important to him. I felt awkward having to ask him to be a guest on my podcast again, so I didn't end up doing it. So you just want to make sure that you start the recording. You can monitor the audio quality throughout the interview, making sure that's good, making sure that it's not buffering, just different things like that. What I like about Riverside is that even if it does buffer a little bit or it just cuts out, as long as the guest was talking, as long as I as the host was talking, it should just pull through that full interview. So even if there's a moment or two where, again, I'm talking, the guest is talking and it gets cut off, the recording software should be able to record it. The last piece is you want to end the recording, just making sure that it's nice and simple. So what I mean by ending the recording is just once you get to the end of the interview, just hitting end. I find it's easier to edit the interviews this way instead of me just continue on and talk with the guest. It just makes it nice and easy for my team, just making sure that we're ending the recording after you've done the interview. And then you want to save the interview that you've done. And I just recommend saving it in two different spots. It might be a little bit overkill, but just in case something happens, where it's going to be saved on Riverside, and then I'm going to download it after I'm done using Riverside. And I usually just throw it into Dropbox just in case something happens to my Riverside account, the files get deleted. And I do this after, as soon as the interview is over. Again, just in case anything happens, I don't have to reach back out to that guest to re-record the interview with them. So again, I recommend Dropbox for that. And the last thing that I recommend is when you're recording a podcast with a remote guest is just make sure that you edit the podcast once it does go live, where maybe you're adding in an intro, maybe you're adding in an outro, maybe you're adding in an ad for your own company. Maybe your podcast has grown successful enough where you can bring in ads from other companies. So you just want to make sure that you edit the podcast and just make it as professional as possible. But I hope these tips were helpful for everyone either listening or watching on how to record a podcast with a remote guest.